Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
The Chinese foreign minister says the cessation of hostilities in the Middle East is imperative. The Russian foreign minister and the U.S. Secretary of State hold a phone call on global issues and bilateral ties. And Ukraine eyes Japan as a potential weapon source after export rules ease. Hello and welcome to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our first story. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says the current situation in the Middle East is at a critical juncture, but a cessation of hostilities is imperative. He made the remarks when holding talks with his Iranian counterparts in Beijing. Saeed Abbas Araghchi issued a briefing on negotiations with the United States. He said Iran will firmly safeguard national sovereignty while continuously building consensus through peaceful negotiations and seeking a permanent solution. He said the opening of the Strait of Hormuz should be addressed properly and as soon as possible. The Chinese foreign minister said China supports Iran in safeguarding its national sovereignty and security and appreciates Iran's willingness to seek a political solution through diplomatic means. For more, we're joined by Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and Fudan University. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Zhang. First of all, Araghchi had spoken with Wang Yi by telephone multiple times following the breakout of hostilities. How would you interpret the timing of the face-to-face talk this time?
Okay, I think this face-to-face meeting between the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi and the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Beijing this time comes at a critical moment because after multiple telephone conversations since the outbreak of this conflict in late February, including calls in March and April where China consistently urged de-escalation. Now, I think this in-person summit signals a deepening of diplomatic coordination between the two sides. And also, I think it reflects China's proactive and constructive role as a trusted partner, which is extremely important at this stage where we see that the situation enters into a critical juncture, and also when we see that the negotiations between the United States and Iran have stalled.
Then what do you think is Iran likely seeking from this visit, and what key issues do you expect to dominate the agenda?
Well, I think currently Iran is likely seeking stronger diplomatic relations with China. And currently, Iran wants to safeguard its own sovereignty and its security interests. Also, it wants to build continued economic partnership. And also, it hopes that the other powers in the world could facilitate the peace talks between Iran and the United States. I think many of the issues might be discussed between the two sides, including the current regional situation for ceasefire, and also the resolution of the Strait of Hormuz issue, also the negotiations between Iran and the United States, how the two sides are going to solve their disagreements. And last but not least, Iran and China might also want to discuss about how to strengthen the bilateral ties of the diplomatic relations.
China has put forward and has been stressing this 4-point proposal on promoting peace and stability in the Middle East, which includes the adherence to the principles of peaceful coexistence, national sovereignty, and the international rule of law. Based on this, what do you think China can offer to Iran?
Well, like you said, China's 4-point proposal was put forward by President Xi in April 2026, and that actually provides a principled framework that China can actively offer. Like you said, China advocates for adherence to peaceful coexistence among neighbors, respect for national sovereignty, upholding of the international rule of law, and a balanced integration of development and security. Right now, I think China can offer credible. So right now, I think China is trying to facilitate negotiations between the two sides. Also, China is willing and it intends to strengthen its economic cooperation with countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. And also, it tries to promote a common comprehensive security architecture for the region in the Middle East. So I think this approach prioritizes win-win outcomes, de-escalation through negotiation, and also long-term stability.
The United States has earlier urged China to pressure Iran over its control of the Strait of Hormuz, while Iran's foreign minister said the opening of the strait should be addressed properly and as soon as possible. First of all, what do you think is the proper solution to the opening of the strait that Iran is calling for?
Well, based on the media reports we can see at this moment, I think the paper solution Iran has proposed might look like a diplomatic negotiated resolution that ensures the safe and free passage of international shipping while fully respecting Iran's legitimate security interests and sovereignty as a coastal state. So this would likely involve, gradual steps. Right now, is trying to address the United States naval blockade on Iranian ports alongside the reopening. So right now, I think Iran seeks to negotiate with the United States regarding this issue. And also, I think Iran tries to emphasize addressing root causes of this conflict via dialogue. Also, they need to have trust-building measures. And last but not least, Iran also wants guarantees that prevent future conflicts and escalation of the confrontation.
Then how would you assess China's stance amid U.S. demands and Iran's security interests in terms of the strait?
Right. I think China's stance is balanced, principled, and also constructive. So in the Middle East, China has always adopted a neutral stance and also zero enemy policy. And right now, China has consistently called for freedom and safety of international navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. And also, China opposes unilateral military actions or blockades that escalate tensions and disrupt the global economy. Instead, China advocates resolving differences through dialogue and negotiation, which is in line with China's four-point proposal and also the United Nations Charter. So I think at this stage, this responsible position allows China to urge restraint from all sides without taking sides. And also, we should note that China always prioritizes stability over confrontation.
Okay, and building on that, how will the strengthened China-Iran diplomatic coordination from this meeting affect geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East?
I think it's important to note that in the current conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran, the attitudes and positions of these three countries and the interactions will finally determine the course and orientation of this conflict. So China has consistently advocated for the escalation of the conflict and promoted peace talks. So I would say diplomatic coordination between China and Iran aims to contribute to the restoration of stability in the Middle East in general.
Now, the U.S. has declared a pause in its operations to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which it says is meant to explore a possible deal with Iran. But with the strait blockade still in effect, how realistic is any meaningful agreement under these conditions?
Well, from my own observation, both the United States and Iran currently have the desire to negotiate and de-escalate the conflict. So despite recent low-intensity problems and skirmishes between the two sides, they are adopting a strategy of downplaying the tensions. However, the problem here is that significant differences remain in the negotiations, particularly because Iran's desire is to first discuss ending the conflict and lifting sanctions, while the United States prefers to address the nuclear issue first. So these differences are very difficult to bridge at the moment. And furthermore, the current strategic differences between the United States and Israel could also introduce further uncertainty into the negotiations.
And finally, do you think that there's anything that the other parties in the international community can do to further push for reaching a possible agreement?
Right. So I think, first of all, whether there could be a final agreement depends more on how the conflicting sides, for instance, the United States, Iran, and Israel think, and how they are interacting with each other. And as for the other parties in the international society, I think what they are doing at the moment is to, first of all, try to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in the region. And also different parties, including international organizations such as the United Nations, are also trying to call for de-escalation of the conflict. And last but not least, also, different parties in the international society are calling for the regional parties in the Middle East to play a more constructive role in this issue. So I would say, in general, different parties in the international society have realized that this is a conflict that has spillover effect to the whole world. And different parties in the world all want to facilitate the de-escalation of this conflict in the Middle East.
Thank you very much. That was Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. Coming up, the Russian Foreign Minister and the U.S. Secretary of State hold a phone call on global issues and bilateral ties. This is World Today. Stay tuned.
Welcome. I am Chuchu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
Welcome back. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has held a phone conversation with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The U.S. State Department said they discussed the U.S.-Russia relationship, the Russia-Ukraine war, and Iran. Russia said the conversation was constructive and businesslike. Now joining us on the line is Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Zhou.
Thank you.
First of all, this is a high-level exchange between two major powers, but now few details have been made public. What do you think that signals?
I think it means it's not that important. This is just kind of a routine exchange of information because both of them are responsible for diplomacy, being top diplomats. So for them to talk about these things is quite normal, and they have not highlighted any points for us to pay special attention. So I believe this is kind of understandable exchanges. But still, I believe from Russia's point of view, its focus is always, of course, Ukraine, while the war in Iran would certainly also have a bearing on Russia's interest. Honestly speaking, I believe Russia is the largest beneficiary out of this war because, first of all, it would siphon away NATO's assistance to Ukraine, even if all American allies refuse to be directly involved. Still, it's a distraction, right? The second thing is it actually would put up the price of oil, which is also good news for Russia. So I think these two things, of course, are interrelated. But having said that, I believe they won't, agree much on how to resolve the standing issue in Ukraine, because I personally believe that Russia has announced, that for oblasts in Ukraine are Russian territory, but so far they're still fighting in East Donbas region with about 10 to 15% still under Ukrainian control. So I believe although the fog of war is still thick, but by and large we can see through it. That is, the eventual settlement would be on Donbas region, while the two other regions, that is Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, would be left for either ceasefire or armistice, something like that.
Now, the conversation between Lavrov and Rubio was described as constructive by the Russian side. But against the backdrop of long-term tensions in U.S.-Russia relations, what specific signs of constructiveness can we infer from this description? And do you think this marks a tentative shift in bilateral interactions?
No, not at all. Because this kind of language of describing something as constructive basically means it is useful. Of course, this kind of conversation is useful, but so what, right? Unless you know something very much specific, to point out it is on Europe. As I have mentioned earlier, the situation is just frozen there, Russia simply cannot afford not to control the remaining 10 to 15% territory in East Donbas region. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians would definitely fight, for their own territory, not to be controlled by Russia. So this is an either-or situation. Right now, both sides accuse the other side of violating ceasefire. This kind of accusation is understandable, but it is not justifiable. So this kind of situation would just, continue for a while. The point is, the year before last, in the whole year, Russia's occupation of a new territory just 1%. And according to NATO, if they keep the current momentum, they can only finish controlling the remaining territory in East Donbas region in August 2027, according to NATO. So you see, this situation is much more complicated, and Russia's progress is not as fast as it has wished.
Now, one of the key topics and probably the most important during the talk is the U.S.-Russia relationship. What core differences still exist between the U.S. and Russia that are hindering the improvement of bilateral relations?
Well, this bilateral relationship certainly has improved since Trump took office, right? And his attitude is quite different from that of Biden. Biden's attitude is very much like those of his American NATO allies in Europe, That is to give full support, to Ukraine. But Trump's intention, I believe, is to finish the war as soon as possible. But in this kind of war attrition, I believe certainly everybody find it difficult. Well, I think it is even more difficult than the war in Iran. In the war in Iran, the central issue is the blockade of the Hormuz Strait, which, in spite of bargaining from both sides, would remain a temporary issue, in my view. But I just can't see how Ukraine would willingly give up its own territory, to Russia. And Russia, because Russia has already announced that the 4 regions are Russian territory, and they're already written into Russian constitution. So therefore, it's very difficult for Russia to back down as well. So I just can't see an immediate, solution in the foreseeable future.
There seems to be a long-term stalemate in the Ukraine and Russia situation, but they have respectively announced unilateral ceasefires. How durable could that be? And what role do you expect the phone conversation between Lavrov and Rubio to play in promoting a further ceasefire negotiation?
Well, unless a ceasefire becomes permanent, or even when a ceasefire is turned into kind of armistice. So these kind of short-term ceasefires, of course, are useful, right? But they're temporary reliefs, right? So I would not believe they are very much important, especially when the two sides, are pointing finger at the other side, saying that you are the one who violated the ceasefire.
And then turning to the Middle East, with the recent U.S. and Israeli war on Iran and the Strait of Hormuz crisis, how do you think the U.S. and Russia might coordinate or diverge their positions on Iran-related issues?
I think basically they would tell each other what they think about it, but there won't be huge coordination between Russia and United States, because the key is in the hands of both Iran and United States. Actually, I would say China probably can play a bigger role than Russia. Otherwise, why would Iranian foreign minister come, right, a week before Trump's visit? So Russia, as I mentioned earlier, is a beneficiary, from this war, for the two reasons I have mentioned. But I don't believe Russia would be a powerful negotiator or mediator in this war at all.
Now, the U.S. has submitted a new draft resolution to the United Nations calling on Iran to stop attacks, mining the Strait of Hormuz and charging fees. After the phone call, Rubio said he was not sure whether Russia would support this resolution. What do you think may be Russia's stance?
If he's not so sure, then I'm not so sure either. But I think what we're seeing now is a kind of ridiculous situation in the Strait of Hormuz, because what we're seeing is a kind of double blockade. Iran has blockade, but the United States also has blockade. In theory, we can only have one, right? Because either Iran controls the strait, or American, by defeating Iranians, could control the strait. But apparently the United States is not having an all-out war against Iran, although Iran's navy is already very much wiped out. But the United States simply doesn't want to be bogged down in a war of attrition. So that is why we just hear from Donald Trump that if these small boats from Iran approach American ships, the United States will annihilate them. But that means if these ships are not approaching American ships, then the United States would not attack them, right? So this is a very weird situation. I believe the United States simply is not going to have an all-out war, because that would be really, really damaging, for Donald Trump, who has already suffered a lot in terms of his image or credibility or his, decision-making, mentality, whatever.
And finally, within 1 minute, in the context of global geopolitical competition, how will the latest U.S.-Russia dialogue affect the balance of great power relations in the world?
Well, in a way, it is useful, but it would not matter that much. If I to tell you about three countries, China, Russia, and the United States, I believe the length, between United States and China to Russia are of the same length. But the length between Russia and the United States actually is much shorter. So this is not a delta, with the three lines of same length. Though that's not the case.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. More to come. Ukraine eyes Japan as a potential weapon source after export rules ease. And China's May Day holiday travel boom highlights consumer vitality, while movie admissions surge over 10%. You're listening to World Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. We'll be back after a short break.
My name is Alessandro Golombieski Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of the World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
You're listening to World Today with me, Do Hongyu, in Beijing. Ukraine is eyeing Japan as a potential weapon source after Tokyo eased export rules. The revised rules still ban Japanese exports to war zones, but allow exceptions for Japan's security interests, a caveat Ukraine hopes to leverage. But to access Japanese military equipment, Ukraine would need to sign a defense technology transfer agreement with Tokyo, similar to those Japan has already concluded with 18 countries, including Germany, Australia, and the Philippines. For more, my colleague Song Ruixin spoke with Dr. Zhang Xin, Deputy Director of the Center for Russian Studies at East China Normal University.
First of all, Dr. Zhang, for our audiences who may not have followed this closely, Japan has long had strict limits on weapon exports. Now what's happening? Why is Japan relaxing its weapons export rules?
Because it traditionally has maintained a set of rules not to export weapons to active conflict zone as part of its gesture as a pacifist state because of its role in World War II. And it's more or less kept that stance for the past few decades. It has not completely relaxed yet. We're waiting to see the results, but there is some voices within the Japanese government to relax that condition, specifically to relax this policy in order to be able to export certain weaponry or form certain military cooperation with Ukraine. And I think the larger story is some of the analysts or politicians see the European theater, Asian Pacific theater are becoming somewhat experiencing a convergence scenario. What happened in, for example, Eurasia, in Ukraine, are going to replicate very soon in Asia Pacific. And that's the so-called security convergence thesis. And for those people who believe in that, then they will see the need for countries like Japan to be more active in its own security context. And they see the fate of Japan somewhat similar to the fate of Ukraine. I think that's the larger context.
And Tokyo, like you said, Professor, it maintains a ban on weapons exports to active conflict zones, yet Kiev hopes to be an exception based on Japan's security interests, so-called security interests. Is that a credible legal loophole?
I think politically or legally, there's definitely room to play with. It's not some sort of strict rules or laws so strict that there's absolutely no room to wiggle around. And then I think that also, for example, one can play with the idea of active conflict zone, or whether there is a real war scenario in Ukraine, or Ukraine is in a war status, etc., in order to have some rooms to relax these rules. So I think the loophole or room is there. Although we are not there yet to say Japan completely has changed or shuttled the pacifist identity because of its interest in exporting weapons to Ukraine. We're not there yet.
Some people argue that Japan has explicitly linked Ukraine's fate to its own security against China. To what extent do you agree?
I do see a tendency to do so, although there is no nationwide solid consensus yet. Certain voices in the Japanese state, in Japanese security apparatus, as well as in Japanese society, are pushing that kind of perception. And we've seen that previously related to the security scenario related to Taiwan, right? To try to tie the so-called Taiwan security scenario with Ukraine. So we're seeing a similar efforts to now push the same argument for Japan. It's an ongoing process. The shift is still part of our ongoing process. And I think what we discussed today will have some impact, whether this kind of trend will ultimately be maturized into become a part of a political reality in Japan.
For now, the Ukrainian ambassador is asking Tokyo for investment in missile defense and drone components, not finished weapons. Is that a clever stepping stone? I mean, normalizing defense industrial cooperation before the bigger ask for lethal exports inevitably follows.
I think it's a practical first step to start with those investments in those specific sectors, which are militarily, politically slightly less sensitive. And I completely agree with you. The next step, if this first step is indeed taken, the next might be a much more expanded, much more deeper arrangement of military cooperation, including lethal weapon exports or joint production of some other lethal weapons of much higher level of, for example, killing capacity. And we've seen Ukraine state and the Ukraine military in the past 2 or 3 years has been very active, especially I would say in the past 1 year, has been stepping up its efforts to look for that kind of international partner of cooperation in the military defense sector beyond the European partners, even in the Middle East. So I think its proposal to Japan is part of this efforts to expand its military and defense cooperation beyond the European countries.
Then if Japanese technology plus Ukrainian battlefield experience produce a, let's say, high-class product with the Japanese drones and micro components flowing into the live combat testing, what does that actually mean for Russian forces on the front lines?
It definitely would put more pressure on Russian forces on the front line. It's hard to say whether that kind of a cooperation would instantly become a tipping point for the battlefield balance as we see now, but it will definitely put more pressure on Russia, particularly in those components that Ukrainian army right now has a very high level of reliance and that does not have a sufficient capacity to produce. So and also, it's possible Japan may provide some of these very specific, either hardware components or very specific technologies that may tailor to Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian army's specific combat field demands. So that can also provide a great help to the Ukrainian army and correspondingly put pressure on the Russian side.
Then, if Japan begins supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine, what will be Russia's reaction?
I think there will be a very negative reaction from Russia instantly. I think the rumor goes the Russian side has shown interest to resume bilateral top-level diplomatic meeting. But I think if the deal of supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine from Japan is indeed a reality, I don't think that kind of diplomatic meeting will happen anytime soon. And also, I think if such a deal does materialize, I think Russia will play very hard its leverage of energy supply to Japan. Recently, we've seen the first major shipment of oil from Russia to Japan. And Japan is in a very difficult energy situation right now. So Russia does have an immediate powerful leverage over anything Japanese state may do with Ukraine through the energy channel.
But Professor, how quickly could Japanese-Ukrainian cooperation translate into actual battlefield results, months or years?
It will not be something we will see on the battlefield in a couple of months, but technically, I think within 6 months to a year, we might see something concrete that may play out of a possible deal. But again, we're not close to that deal yet.
Right, we've seen Sanai Takaichi accelerated Japan's military build-up, but has given no public signal on arming Ukraine. Professor, will she move before the defense strategy roll out this year or kick the can until after local elections?
I think there's a big question mark how much Prime Minister Takaichi put his personal political career, attached that to the Japanese potential deal with Ukraine, including the armament deal. So I don't think this is a key priority for her right now. So it's totally possible he might tone down on this particular issue as he see how things goes with the local election or with her own prospects in the government. And also, I think in terms of defense strategy, this part of possible arming Ukraine is a very small part very small component with some symbolic significance, but overall it's a very small component. It doesn't take a top priority. So I think what you suggest, move before the defense strategy rollout, or wait until the local election, then also cancel any further efforts to push this deal, are very likely.
That was Dr. Zhang Xin, Deputy Director of the Center for Russian Studies at East China Normal University. Coming up, China's May Day holiday travel boom highlights consumer vitality. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Hello, I'm Yan Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
China's Ministry of Transportation estimates that there were 1.5 billion domestic trips over the 5-day Labor Day holiday, up 4%. The railway system added more than 2,000 trains to meet demand. Meanwhile, border inspection authorities nationwide handled over 11.2 million inbound and outbound trips by Chinese and foreign travelers. Foreign entries and exits exceeded 1.2 million, an increase of 12.5%. Consumer spending in retail, hospitality, and cinema was also robust over the holiday. With more, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University.
So, Yan, the May Day holiday is often seen as a barometer of consumer confidence. So what do this year's travel and spending surge tell us about China's economic momentum right now?
Well, I think this is really on the heel of a stable economic recovery and growth, as we saw from the first quarter in China, where the GDP real growth rate reached 5%, and you saw the retail sales growth of consumer goods by 2.4%, and then retail sales of services have gone up by 5.5%. So I think based on this very solid economic growth, I think we are expecting to see the May Day holiday spending grow even faster than last year. And last year, the 5-day holiday had a total spending increase by 8%, and with 314 million domestic trips. I think judging from the starting day of this May Day holiday, you saw really record travels from highways, waterways, railways, and airways. So, and then that coupled with all the efforts by local governments, by also businesses, they have put in many of these cultural events, over 13,000 different cultural events, and over 30,000 commercial performances. So I would expect that based on this economic recovery and based on all this emphasis and all these efforts to boost holiday consumption and holiday travel and spending, I'd expect to see really significant growth in this year's travels and consumer spending.
And today's consumers are more experience-driven and pursue cultural value. So how is this reshaping China's tourism and retail sectors?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that we saw the growth in service, the demand for service, retail sales for services usually grew at more than double the rate of the consumer goods retail increase. So I think, as you mentioned, that as income grows, as consumers look for more and more emotional values, experiences from consumption, I think they very naturally pivot towards more, experience-driven consumption, and where they can, experience different cultures, different scenes, and have more interactions as families, and also with the local, culture, food, and cultural events, and they'll also be able to seek emotional fulfillments from these consumption. We're likely to see, I think, more and more this kinds of experience-driven consumption growth. So, for example, I think since according to Meituan, which is, as we know, one of the largest on-demand service platform, searches for music festivals have quadrupled since April, and experiential activities such as ethnic photography and hot air balloon rides have risen by 30% to over 70%. So in other words, I think more and more consumers are not just trying to buy, in terms of concrete physical goods, but they more and more value the experiences and tourism, travels, and cultural entertainment, as well as leisure and sports. I think that would likely become a much faster growing areas for consumption.
Well, we know that Chinese consumers and travelers, they are very discerning when it comes to destinations, when it comes to their choice of products, services, and experience. So how are you seeing local governments and businesses focusing on to create the innovative consumption formats to unlock new demand?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think on the one hand, governments and businesses are really trying to meet the demands for consumers, but at the same time, they also actively create conditions and try to cultivate this kind of experience-driven growth. So I think for the government, we have seen over 248 million yuan in consumption cultures that have been issued by various local governments to provide more incentives for travel and cultural events. So these are, vouchers are used to subsidize attraction tickets, hotels, and cultural performances. So I think for governments, they could really provide more incentives for consumers. And second is I think that, many different localities also launched targeted measures to provide a kind of regional incentives, all kinds of, for example, cultural consumption seasons. Crayfish consumption season is one thing that I think is quite interesting in Wuhan to boost the catering sector. And in addition to that, I think local governments are also playing a very important role in terms of building the infrastructure to attract more consumers and to provide them more satisfactory experience. For example, building more museums, and sports stadiums, and also push these museums or stadiums to extend their operation hours. So I think all of this will be very helpful to attract more consumers. And then for businesses, I think you're right, creative is really the key word. Businesses need to be more creative, create new kind of consumption experiences, and also utilize, I think, social platforms or technologies. So for example, in some areas, there are companies that are using drones for snack deliveries in certain mountain areas, and they also use robots to help, trackers. And all of this, I think, help to enhance the value of premium tourism. Same thing with retailers. They're also using, VR experiences, and they're using all kinds of, tech to give, I think, consumers an upgraded experience when they shop in, for example, physical, malls. So I think all of this will be really helpful to boost consumptions, both incentives and their interest in, fostering the different new consumption scenarios.
And with so many brands chasing the same experience and consumption trends, how do you think companies can better differentiate themselves to truly engage the Chinese consumers?
It's really important for businesses to focus on four aspects. One is that, I think the general sort of principle is that they need to move away from very passive sales towards more, emotionally resonant, interactive, and hyper-personalized consumption. So what that means is, first of all, they need to focus on the quality, because I think in terms of the quality of services and products that the businesses provide would really go a long way to entice consumers to return and, shop more. So quality, I think, is really the key. The second, I think, as you mentioned earlier, is the creativity. To create immersive environments, interactive, retail, as I mentioned earlier, using augmented reality, for instance, to really upgrade the consumer experience. And also, with all this, as I also mentioned earlier, ethnic photography and hot balloon rides, and also using technologies to provide some of the city tours, All of these, I think, would also be very helpful, be creative, right? And to create this unique experiential activities for consumers. And third is connected to the creativity. It's really use technologies, right? So now we're seeing many websites for travel agencies like Qunar and Fliggy. They're using AI to design custom hiking, trekking, and city walk paths. So using AI, I think, could again help to design the kinds of activities that consumers would enjoy. And last but not the least, I think effective utilization of social media and community-based marketing, I think that's also very helpful because once consumers get positive experience, they will spread the word on social media. And so that would, again, help to generate more foot traffic. For some of the shopping malls, for example, they're adding social lounge and hobby meet-up spaces for consumers. So again, promote consumption as a more social events. I think that would also be helpful for businesses.
That was Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University. Coming up in the show, we'll move on to China's May Day holiday movie market. This is World Today. Stay tuned. China's film market recorded steady growth during the May Day holiday period. According to the China Film Administration, the number of tickets sold surpassed 20 million, over 10% higher than the same period last year. Total box office revenue reached 758 million yuan, about $110 million US dollars. Crime thriller Vanishing Point led the box office with 264 million yuan, accounting for over one-third of total revenue. Meanwhile, the average ticket price stood at 36.3 yuan, down 8% from the same period last year. For more, we're joined by Yao Shujie, Chiang Professor of Economics at Chongqing University. Thank you for joining us, Professor Yao. This year's May Day holiday box office was slightly higher than last year, but it is noticeable that the structure has shifted because the ticket prices fell by 8%, while admissions rose by over 10%. Why is there a drop in film ticket prices?
Yes, you look at the major films over the May Day holidays. Some of them are imported from the Americas. And because of the appreciation of the renminbi against the US dollar, that probably explain part of the reason why the price is a little bit down. And secondly, I think the studios, they are trying to reduce the price to attract more audience, to maximize the number of audience, so that it can increase the so-called multiply effect of the film industry, over the local, tourism and also hoteling and other business activities. So this is probably a comprehensive, integrated effort by the studio and the film industry to attract the bigger market activities for the aggregate global economy.
Besides lower prices, what else is encouraging more people to go to cinemas?
Well, I think the modern facility, the service quality, and also the supervision of other services surrounding the studios. The most attractive condition for moviegoers nowadays is probably the environment of the studio surrounding the shopping mall, that people find it very convenient to go and very comfortable in going to the to the studio for watching a film with lots of enjoyment. Now, if you go to every city in China, you feel that the film is so in a very admirable environment of the studio surrounding it. So this is why it's getting more and more attractive. Another is that the studio is getting more diversified. Many of it is for the adults, and some of them is for children and families, and they provided the kinds of equipment and facility to attract different kinds of audience. And this is, I think, partly explained by the so-called marketing strategy of the regulated industries.
Now, China is increasingly linking the film industry with other sectors. such as retail and tourism. For example, offering discounts at restaurants and shopping malls for moviegoers. First, how do you assess the impact of this Film Plus ecosystem on the broader economy in China?
Yeah, the Film Plus ecosystem is an integral part of China's service industries. The Chinese government at all levels is promoting, the service industry and also promoting consumptions. Now, this is reflected, in this film, kinetic industries, the upstream and downstream. The producers, the technology, and also the people who are making the film more attractive, and also the people who show the film to the audience. And the service industry provided the kinetic services to make the moviegoers much more attractive and comfortable. Nice experience not only in the sitting environment but also in the eating and also restaurant, and sometimes it also hold hotels surrounding it and shopping. So lots of families with children, for example, during the weekend or holiday, they take the children for going for shopping, buying things, and then at the same time they spend a couple of hours watching a movie. So they finish a very fruitful days and enjoyable experience for the family and also for the children as well.
Mm-hmm. This year, it is in this holiday, it is also noticeable that the Hollywood movie The Devil Wears Prada 2 was released in China one day earlier than in the North American market. What does this suggest about the importance and attractiveness of the Chinese market for global filmmakers?
China has becoming a very increasing important place for movie makers to make profit and revenue. And why it released one day earlier? Because it want to meet the Chinese Main Day holiday. Because the Main Day holiday, people have more time and also are more willing to spend money during this period. So the film, any attractive film, have to release on time in order to attract the maximum audience. And in this case, the Devil Wears Prada 2 is precisely using this kind of strategy one day earlier than the home country in the United States. This is because of China is very attractive. The second reason is China have a huge population and a huge middle class. People are more willing to go to the movies, and it has a potential for attracting more and more audience. China is nowadays become the leading post office, the box office, nations in terms of movie revenue and related industries. Especially the most advanced and attractive filmmaker in the United States and other countries, they would regard China as the highly profitable, market for these kinds of film activities.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Yao Shujie, Chiang Kong Professor of Economics at Chongqing University. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. A quick recap of today's headlines. The Chinese foreign minister has said a cessation of hostilities in the Middle East is imperative. The Russian foreign minister and the U.S. Secretary of State have held a phone call on global issues and bilateral ties. And Ukraine is eyeing Japan as a potential weapon source after export rules ease. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching for World Today. For further discussion, you can follow us on X at CGTN Radio. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.